Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Marines Memorial Association is a 501c19 veterans nonprofit organization with a mission to honor the legacy of military service. The Marines Memorial Foundation is a 501c3 organization with the purpose of supporting the association's programs. Since opening our doors in 1946, the Marines Memorial has grown to 20,000 members all around the world. To support veterans and all those serving in the United States Armed Forces, the Marines Memorial accomplishes their mission through three action words: commemorate, educate, and serve, and through some lines of effort: the Gold Star Honor and Remembrance, the Living Memorial, Active Duty Aid and Assist, scholarships, education and commemorative events such as this program tonight. Programs including the Meet the Author series are only possible through the generosity of our members and donors. I'm Colonel Brendan Kearney. I'm the director of the Living Memorial here at the Marines Memorial. Paul Scharre is our Meet the Author guest tonight. Paul's bio is in the folder that is on all the seats that are here in the room, so I'd encourage all of you to peruse that diligently. I went through the book. It's really a joy to read in the sense that technology, if not so much that it's dumbed down, but at least is put in English, can be a joyful experience to read. If it's kept at the scientific level, God help all of us as we try to muddle through it. But it brought back to me my days in what Paul was describing in 1986, spending a couple weeks in one of California's real scenic spots, China Lake, and doing the operational testing for the Pioneer RPV that the Marine Corps had gotten on loan from the Israeli air industries and the Israeli Defense Forces. If you read Paul's book, you'll find that, as any good author should, that he goes through and he draws our attention to things that we, our society today, can reference. And in Paul's case, he makes a couple references to the movie series, The Terminator. Please join me in welcoming Paul.
You'll have to forgive me. I'm a little bit hobbled, so I'm going to give this presentation seated. Don't take that as a lack of enthusiasm for the topic. I think it's a really interesting topic. Very excited to share with you the book that I've written on this. I spent several years writing, and before that, a number of years in the Pentagon working on this issue. The challenge that we're dealing with today is that we have robotic vehicles around the globe that are used by militaries. I'm glad you mentioned some science fiction stories. The stories that we hear out of science fiction are ones where we create these artificial machines, and then one day they turn against us, whether it's Terminator or Westworld or something else. What we're seeing in the real world is that ever more advanced robotic vehicles are being born with a gun in their hands. There are at least 16 countries that have armed drones today. That number keeps going up. I'll have to update this map shortly as they continue to proliferate. And as you can see on the map, you can tell where they're coming from. It's not from the US. Over 90% of armed drone transfers internationally come from China. And so the US is not really driving the train here. The technology is widely diffused. Islamic State and other non-state groups have armed drones as well. Crude ones that they've cobbled together using commercially available drones and then putting explosives on them. And we've seen these used for attacks in Iraq and Syria. Now, with each generation, these military robotic vehicles are becoming ever more autonomous. This picture is probably more than a decade old now. This is the X-45 experimental demonstration drone aircraft. It's one of the first generation of many drones that are being built around the globe by militaries that have more autonomy, that are intended to operate in contested areas, in combat environments. And just like we're seeing in automobiles, with each generation, these have more autonomous features. So the central question that this book grapples with is what happens when a Predator drone has as much autonomy as a self-driving car? How much freedom are we willing to delegate these machines, particularly when we're talking about life and death decisions on the battlefield? It's not just in the air. We're seeing ever more advanced robotic vehicles being built on land and at sea as well. This is an uninhabited boat built by the Office of Naval Research that was conducting a demonstration of swarming boat behavior. So these boats were not only autonomous, but communicating with one another, operating in this demonstration as a swarm of boats that would protect a high-value vessel in its transit through a simulated strait. This was done on the James River in Virginia, but it's a very public demonstration, pretty pointedly aimed by the Navy at Iran, at showing some of our capabilities to better protect U.S. vessels through strait transits in the future. In this demonstration, what they did is they had a suspicious vessel approaching, and then a human tasked this robotic swarm of boats to go intercept this suspicious vessel and encircle it. And in the demonstration, these boats were armed. And afterwards, the Navy said, well, look, people will be in charge of actually controlling the weapons on board. The boats themselves might be autonomous. People will be in charge of the weapons. But there are many other countries that also have access to this technology. This is the Israeli Guardian uninhabited ground vehicle. It's a robotic vehicle that's been deployed on the Gaza border doing patrols there. You can't see in this photo, but it is also reportedly armed. Again, Israel has said that the vehicle itself might be autonomous. It drives on its own, but humans are controlling the weapons. But not every country is going to see it that way. Russia, this is a Russian robotic ground vehicle called the Uran-9. Russia has said that they envision in the future having fully roboticized units that are capable of independent operations, a much more ambitious goal. Now, this vehicle, you see, not only has a heavy machine gun and rockets, the rockets actually are on an elevated platform, so it can hide behind a hillside and then potentially ambush enemy tanks. Just this week, reports came out that this robotic vehicle was deployed by Russia to Syria and is in combat in Syria. So this is not just things in demonstrations, not just in labs. These are technologies that's coming out of the labs and into the real world today. This is the X-47 demonstration aircraft from several years ago that the Navy built, deployed on aircraft carriers, the first to autonomously take off and land on an aircraft carrier, the first to autonomously refuel, an important milestone for more effective combat drones. Now this, you'll notice, looks quite different than a Predator or, say, a Global Hawk drone. It has this sort of sleek design indicative of a stealth aircraft. Now this is not an operational aircraft, it's just a demonstrator, but there are many drones that countries around the world are building that look like this. Some of them, like those in China, for example, look eerily like US drones. But countries are building these types of demonstration drones as a bridge to future combat aircraft that would be designed to operate inside contested airspace, in enemy airspace, in denied areas, and in particular in places where communications will be very challenging. Where unlike, say, over Afghanistan, where you might be able to have all sorts of communications with your drones, we would expect these communications to be jammed by adversaries. In fact, the Pentagon actually reported last month that Russia has been jamming the communications of US drones over Syria. So against a more high-tech adversary, these communications will be very challenging. And that will beg the question of what do you want this aircraft to do when it's out on its own? When it loses its link to a human controller? Should it come home? Should it go and do surveillance missions, take pictures and come back? Should it strike pre-planned targets? That's kind of what a cruise missile does today. Maybe a human programs in the coordinates ahead of time. Or what if it comes across what we sometimes refer to as targets of opportunity? A mobile target that's moving. That's how we've seen a lot of warfare evolve towards mobile and relocatable targets. Maybe let's imagine something like a North Korean mobile missile launcher. Very high value target, something we want to go after. What would you have it do there? Would we allow it to, say, maybe attack this target on its own? These are very real questions that militaries will have to grapple with in the coming years as they begin to deploy these systems. We're writing the code for these kinds of robotic vehicles today. And in fact, it was this very specific issue that motivated, well, almost 10 years ago now, the Pentagon policy on autonomy in weapons that was eventually published in 2012. At the time, I was working in the Pentagon, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and I posed the same question to my boss. And I said, well, what do you want this thing to do? We also know that the B-21 bomber is reportedly going to be optionally manned, eventually someday. What do you want it to do if the human's not in the loop? And he said, well, I want it to come home. I said, well, that's great, but it doesn't mean anything. Where's that written down? Where's the policy for that? So that eventually led to the current policy that was passed in 2012 that's still in effect today. So this is a very real practical question militaries have to grapple with. Self-defense is also an issue. This is the Sea Hunter. It's a Navy ship that is now part of the operational fleet. It is an entirely robotic ship. Now you can see in the photo there's people standing on top of it, but it's intended to operate with no one on board. There will still be people controlling it remotely, but again, if someone were to come aboard and jam its communications and try to board it, what would you want it to do? There was an incident about 1.5 years ago where China grabbed control of a US Navy underwater drone in the South China Sea. China just took it. There was no one there to stop them. Now they said afterwards, the US sort of cried out about this, give us our drone back. The China said, oh, we're so sorry. We didn't mean to. That was totally unauthorized. Just some junior person did this on their own. And they give it back. But this is a $20 million vessel with a lot of sensitive equipment on board. Its mission is submarine hunting. It's intended to track enemy submarines. So would we be comfortable letting this just fall into someone else's hands? Or would you maybe authorize it to use force to defend itself? It's not just in robotic vehicles that we're seeing more autonomy. This is the screenshot for a video depicting the long-range anti-ship missile. It's a US missile that has quite a bit of autonomy, really pushing the boundaries of what we're seeing. In this case, the human still chooses the target, the ship intended to attack enemy ships, but the missile itself can change its route on the way. So this video here is depicting this idea that on the way to its target, it might run into a pop-up threat. That's the red bubble that you see in the screen. And the missile itself would choose to change its route to move around this potential threat. Again, now for now, humans are still choosing the target. But it begs the question of, would there be a follow-on evolution in these missiles where they might get to the point where they could choose their own targets? Some degree of autonomy in munitions has been around for decades. This is a photo of the high-speed anti-radiation missile on a Navy F-18. It's an anti-radar missile that's widely used by the US and then similar missiles like this by many other countries to attack enemy radars. We've had munitions for at least 70 years since World War II that are fire and forget weapons. Once you launch them, they're not coming back. But humans still choose the target. I'll describe them in this diagram as what you see depicted in the blue is what I'll call semi-autonomous weapons. So we have around the globe today weapons where the human knows that there is an enemy in a given location in place, given sort of geographic space at a given point in time. And the human says, I want to attack this tank, this ship, this submarine. And they may not have a lot of information. In some cases, it might be just a ping down a line of bearing along a sonar underwater. But the human says, there's an enemy here, I'm going to attack them. And then we might release some munition, could be a missile, could be a torpedo, to go after and attack this enemy target. The technology that's coming down the road, and it exists in some crude forms today, is the potential to build what I'll call fully autonomous weapons, which you see in the red. A weapon that could go out over a wide area and hunt for its own targets. Now, humans would be building these. Humans would be programming them. We're not talking about robots building robots. It's not yet. And humans would launch them, but the human would not need to know maybe where the enemy is. You could simply consult your war plans and say, well, it seems reasonable to think the enemy might send tanks into this valley. Or there might be submarines in this sea. And I'm going to let the robot go find them all on its own. And that fundamentally begins to change the relationship that humans have with violence on the battlefield. Now, crude forms, simple forms of this kind of autonomy have existed for a while. This is a photo of the Phalanx gun. It's used on US Navy ships, part of the Aegis combat system, and used on land by the Army in the Counter-Rocket Artillery and Mortar System, or CRAM. And it's used for situations where the speed of incoming threats would overwhelm the human sitting behind the console. So it's an entirely robotic system, at least has a mode that you could turn it to that has a full auto mode, sometimes referred to as R2-D2 because of the drone, sort of the dome on it. And it's used in settings where humans could be overwhelmed by the speed of engagements. There's no ability for humans to respond at all in real time. Systems of this type are used by at least 30 countries around the globe today. Other examples are the Patriot air and missile defense system, or the Aegis combat system on Navy ships, here shown firing a missile. But these are all used in relatively limited settings. They're used to defend ships or vehicles or bases. They're used in defensive settings. Humans are part of these installations. They're defending people. And most importantly, humans can supervise their operation in real time, could intervene if they began to malfunction, and humans have physical access to the system. So if it began to fail, there are ways to actually humans can physically pull the plug. On the Aegis, on this system, there's a key. They can turn a key and disable the electrical circuits to the firing. So what happens when we begin to look at something that is more autonomous, that is offensive, that is entirely on its own, where we don't have that degree of control? There is at least one example in use today. This is the Israeli Harpy drone. It's built by Israel. It's been sold to Turkey, South Korea, India, and China. And China has reportedly reverse engineered their own version of this. We've yet to see wider proliferation of this, but it's certainly a possibility. The Harpy is different in that it can go and search for targets over a wide area on its own. It also hunts radars, but unlike the missile I showed earlier, the high-speed anti-radiation missile, the HARM, which flies for about 5 minutes, this can fly for 2.5 hours and can search over hundreds of kilometers all on its own. And when it finds an enemy radar, it doesn't ask for permission. It can kamikaze into the radar on its own without any further human approval. It's not the only weapon of this type that's ever been built, although they've not been widely used. Back in the 1980s, the US Navy had a missile called the Tomahawk anti-ship missile, or TASM, that was designed to do something similar, to go over the horizon to hunt Soviet ships. Here's a diagram from it. You see that it was intended to go and then fly a search pattern looking for these. It was taken out of service in the 90s. And through the book, I talked to interviews with retired naval officers who are familiar with it. One of the concerns they raised was, if you have this weapon that's intended to go look for the enemy, if you don't know where the enemy is, why are you launching the missile? Now, this is a particular problem when it comes to missiles in that they're expensive, you have a limited magazine capacity for them, and they're non-recoverable. You launch it, you're not going to get it back. This begins to change with drones today. As we begin to field drones that are recoverable, you could send a drone out on patrol, and if it doesn't find the enemy, it could come back, and you could launch it again tomorrow. And so we may see this dynamic begin to change and see more weapons like this deployed around the globe. We're seeing more advanced autonomy in a variety of settings. This is a photo from experiments done by the Naval Postgraduate School at Camp Roberts in California, where in this instance, they're working on swarming combat. Not just one autonomous vehicle, but multiple autonomous vehicles. In the book, I open up the first chapter with an experiment I went and witnessed that they were doing, where they had 10 versus 10 swarm-on-swarm combat. And they were programming these swarms to fight, not just in simulations, but actual physical demonstrations up in the air, doing simulated dogfighting against each other. And they're working up to a 50-on-50 aerial swarm dogfight. And this raises whole new concepts for tactics of warfighting. How do you fight with swarms? What do you command a swarm to do? What are the best maneuvers to fight with a swarm, and how does it compete with another one? And these are things that researchers are working on, not just in the US, but around the globe. We're also seeing more advanced autonomy in cyber systems. This is a map of one version of Stuxnet spread across the internet as it hunted for its targets. So Stuxnet, which took down Iranian centrifuges, was itself a highly autonomous system, could spread across networks. Once it found them, found its intended target, deploy a payload to hijack control of these centrifuges all by itself without any further human control. And we're seeing ever more advanced autonomy in cyber systems. This is Mayhem. It's the computer system that won DARPA's Cyber Grand Challenge from a few years ago. The Grand Challenge was designed to build a completely autonomous cyber system that could search software and find vulnerabilities all on its own, and then could either defensively patch these vulnerabilities or offensively exploit them. And these autonomous hackers they're not better than the top human hackers in the world, but they're in the top 20 right now. It's pretty good. Certainly good enough to be used. The company that built Mayhem has been contracted by DoD to deploy systems like this on DoD's network to begin to patch up any holes or vulnerabilities within DoD networks autonomously. So we're already seeing this kind of technology being used operationally. Now, these technologies raise a host of really difficult ethical and legal and policy and strategic issues. I cover this in depth in the book. Each of these things I'm going to go through is like a whole chapter in its own right. So I'm just going to skim over some of the key ideas. But a key thing that comes up often is, well, what about the laws of war? Would these weapons be illegal? The interesting thing is that the laws of war, they don't ever specify that a human has to make these targeting decisions. The laws of war specify behavior, they specify effects on the battlefield. Militaries have to comply with the principle of distinction. They can't target civilians, they have to distinguish between civilians and military combatants. Militaries have to comply with the principle of proportionality, so that says that there may be some civilian collateral damage in war. We acknowledge that happens. Militaries don't have to be perfect, but any collateral damage that affects civilians can't be disproportionate to the military necessity of the target that's being attacked. Now, in some instances, these may be very high bars to reach to use these autonomous weapons that would choose their own targets in a lawful manner. If you wanted to deploy these weapons today with existing technology in, say, a dense urban environment where there were civilians in the mix, or maybe you were targeting people, this would be very hard to do this with existing technology. But there are other settings where it definitely could be done. If you wanted to deploy, for example, these weapons underwater to hunt submarines entirely on their own, well, look, if it's a large metal object underwater, it's a military submarine. It's not a hospital, it's not a school bus, or something else it's going to be. It might be your submarine. That's a challenge. But it simplifies some of these legal constraints. Another concern that comes up often is a moral and ethical concern. It may be legal, but is it right? And some people will argue, well, it's fundamentally wrong, regardless of what the law says, to allow machines to make these life and death decisions. This is a really complex and interesting issue. I will say, quite frankly, when we first worked on this issue in the Pentagon several years ago, we focused really on what does the law say. We didn't get too in depth into these legal issues, these ethical issues. As I've worked more and more on this over time and dug into this in researching the book and talking to others, I think these are some of the most interesting and difficult problems to grapple with. Because war does raise some very difficult moral and ethical choices. I'll give one example from my time in Afghanistan. We were operating, I was part of a Ranger sniper team up on the Afpak border with Pakistan, and we were trying to monitor infiltration routes from foreign fighters coming across the Pakistan border into Afghanistan. And one morning, very early on, we'd infiltrated at night under cover of darkness, and the sun came up. In this part of Afghanistan, at least, there was not a whole lot of cover, not a lot of trees. We were above the tree line, and the rocky outcropping we're behind did not conceal us as well as we might have hoped in darkness. And it was very clear that the village underneath us could see us. And it wasn't long before they had sent a little girl to come scout out our position. Now, she had a couple goats in tow, but it was pretty clear that she was there to do reconnaissance on us. She was maybe 5 or 6. She wasn't honestly very sneaky. She was like staring at us as she kind of walked around us. And we watched her, and she watched us as she kind of did a long circle around us. And eventually she left, and it wasn't long after before some Taliban fighters came along afterwards. So we took care of them, and then the gunfight that ensued brought out the whole valley, and so we eventually had to exfiltrate. But later we talked about what we would do in a similar situation if we found this. And one of the things we talked about is, well, maybe we would try to apprehend the civilian, maybe we'd pat them down, see if they had a radio on them. If we were compromised, we'd try to understand if the enemy knew where we were. One of the things I can tell you did not come up was the idea of shooting this little girl. It was not a conversation we had. Now, what's interesting is it would have been legal under the laws of war. The laws of war do not set an age for combatants. Whether you are an enemy combatant is determined based on your actions. And in this case, she was participating in hostilities by scouting for the enemy. Now, the fact that she was a little girl and she didn't know any better, she didn't understand what she was doing, that doesn't change that under the laws of war. She's still an enemy combatant. So if you had programmed a robot to follow the laws of war, it would have shot this little girl. Now, is that consistent with American values? Is that right in that instance to do that? This raises a really difficult question about how robots would deal with ethical considerations in war and how they might know the difference between what's legal and what's right. Another concern that comes up is that where these weapons might be destabilizing, that they might threaten international security and stability in a way that might make it more likely that countries might go to war in the first place. As one example, I'll point to what we've seen in stock trading, where we actually have now, in the past several years, reached a domain of stock trading that is highly automated, where there is quite a bit of machine trading, and we've seen accidents that come from this. This is a screenshot of the Dow Jones during the flash crash several years ago. And we've seen actually several flash crashes since then, where these algorithms interacting at machine speed in milliseconds have unexpected interactions that lead to things like flash crashes, or they have vulnerabilities that humans take advantage of. Something else that's come to light in the investigations afterwards, that in this particular instance, there was a London-based trader who was taking advantage of weaknesses in these algorithms and spoofing them, and using a weakness in their algorithms to manipulate their behavior to try to change prices intentionally. And that's illegal to do that. And he eventually got arrested. But in war, you don't have regulators that can say, well, this isn't fair, don't do that. And you don't have what regulators have done to deal with this problem, which is they've installed circuit breakers that would take stocks offline if the stock price moves too quickly in a period of time. Well, there's no one to call timeout in war if your robots and your algorithms begin interacting with the enemies in a way that you did not expect. And there are similar competitive similarities between stock trading and war. You have a competitive environment, you have an advantage in speed, you're certainly not going to share your algorithms with your enemy. And so what would happen if we face something like a flash war? How do we anticipate and then try to mitigate against that kind of risk? For 5 years now, there have been discussions going on internationally about autonomous weapons, where countries have been coming together at the United Nations to discuss what, if anything, might be done about these. There have been a consortium of non-governmental organizations led by Human Rights Watch and others as part of what they refer to as a campaign to stop killer robots. A bit of an inflammatory term, but intended to, I think, drum up interest. And you see some of them in the foreground here. There have been at least 24 countries that have said that they would like a ban on these weapons before they could be built. But none of these countries that have signed up to them are leading military powers or actually leading robotics developers. They're not really the countries that are advancing the technology in any case. And so, meanwhile, the technology continues to move forward. I want to close talk a little bit about how senior Defense Department leaders have talked about this. The US has been incredibly transparent, much more so than other countries, about how it's thinking about this technology. As I mentioned earlier, there is an official Pentagon policy on this. It's on the web. You can read it if you're willing to wade through the bureaucratic kind of legalese in the document. It's openly available for anyone. But also senior leaders have talked quite a bit about how they're thinking about this challenge. You see here in the foreground, former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, who was a leading champion for artificial intelligence and autonomy during his time in the Pentagon. And in the background there, General Paul Scharre, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They've both spoken on this quite a bit, and one of the things they've talked about is their vision today, at least, is that humans would remain in charge of lethal decisions for now. That it's their intention, as the US military moves forward with greater autonomy in robotic systems, for humans to remain in control of these decisions. But they have posed the question of what would our adversaries do? And how would we respond if at some point in time in the future our adversaries decide that they are going to take humans out of the loop of these decisions? And maybe there's an advantage in speed, like we've seen, for example, in stock trading. How would we respond? General Scharre has referred to this as somewhat colorfully, I think, as the Terminator Conundrum. And Work has made statements like, well, if our enemies build Terminators and they're not as good but they're faster, how do we respond? So this is really fundamentally the challenge, which is that we are not the only ones who get to decide where this technology is taking us. I'll close with a quote from General Scharre, where he talks about keeping humans in control of warfare. I think it's a valuable sentiment. The challenge here is, you'll see at a very high level, he's talking about sort of keeping ethical rules of war in place, keeping humans in control. What does this mean in practice? How do you instantiate this into technology? So as we move forward, ultimately, the challenge we're grappling with is, how do we find ways to use this technology that not only give military advantage, that might also make war more humane, more precise. Just like we're seeing in self-driving cars, where they're going to ultimately make roads safer eventually. Are there ways to use automation that might reduce civilian casualties in war, but also keep humans in control? And how do we use this technology in a way that doesn't lose our humanity in the process? Very excited to come here and talk with you today about this. I hope you'll check out the book. You can check out my website. Hit me up on Twitter if you're into that kind of thing. And thanks very much for coming here today. And then we're open to taking questions. Thank you.
What is the likelihood of a drone being hacked? And is there a countermeasure for this?
Relatively early on in the Iraq War, where insurgents were, hacking is probably too strong of a word, they were eavesdropping, if you will, on predator drone feeds and observing them. But they're basically just unencrypted feeds. So if you had like an old UHF television, you could just tune the dial to the right frequency and listen in. We've since encrypted them. There was another incident not long after where a US drone sort of mysteriously crash landed in Iran. A stealth drone, an RQ-170. There were Iranian claims that they had hacked it, that they found some way to take control of it and grab it. The US said that was not the case. Eventually, after some hemming and hawing, the US government did admit that it was in fact their drone. It had just sort of strayed off course, so you can kind of choose to believe who you want. But certainly, in theory, it's possible. We've seen on the commercial market, people have already done this. There was somebody who built a quadcopter that could go out and jam and take control over the unencrypted links that other quadcopters were using to build this sort of flying zombie drone army that he could assemble, right? Just flying around and taking control of other people's drones. So it's certainly a major risk. Now, I'll point out that anything that has a computer chip in it is vulnerable to hacking. That's not unique to a robotic system. In fact, we've seen automobiles get hacked already. We've seen automobiles get hacked, and people can take control of the steering or the brakes or disable them. What is unique about autonomy is what happens next. Because what autonomy does is empower this machine to be able to make its own actions. So let's say that you hacked a vehicle today that's manually driven. It'd be very hard to actually remotely drive this vehicle. You might be able to disable the power steering of the brakes and run it off the road and kill someone, but try not to be able to drive it. Certainly not going to take control of hundreds of them or thousands of them. If you imagine in the future we have self-driving cars on the road, that could change. You might be able to hack an entire fleet of them and tell all of them to drive to some new destination. So that's, I think, a very profound concern when it comes to these weapons, is that as you put in more autonomy, if someone were to hack it and take control of it, the effect could be quite different and even quite catastrophic potentially.
Knowing that international treaties are weak, the UN is weak, NATO can't operate globally, and the US will not allow any international body, an example being the International Criminal Court, to exert control over the US. Will this type of warfare ever be regulated like the Geneva Convention?
Okay, so there's a certain bias inherent in that question that I'm gonna try to just untwist a little bit. The history of arms control is very mixed. There are many examples of failed attempts to regulate weapons. And in the course of this conversation, these come up a lot. Things like the Pope's attempt to ban the crossbow in the Middle Ages. Totally failed. There's no evidence that it had any effect on the spread of the crossbow across medieval Europe. There were early 20th century attempts to ban poison gas, to ban air-delivered weapons, to regulate submarines, all of which subsequently failed in World War I and World War II. There are some examples of successes, though. Poison gas was not used, at least on the battlefields among combatants in Europe, in World War II. All sides had them, they had tens of thousands of tons of them, but they weren't used. Now, I don't think it was because that they were illegal prior to World War I as well, so there were other factors at play. But there are successful arms control regimes during the Cold War, bans, certainly regulations on nuclear weapons that prohibit placing nuclear weapons on the seabed or in space, prohibitions on placing WMD in space, placing weapons on the moon. Some of these you could argue maybe not that valuable, placing weapons on the moon, for example, outside of James Bond films. But there are bans on blinding lasers. There are treaties banning landmines and cluster munitions that are adhered to by some reasonable number of countries. There are bans on using the environment as a weapon that have been adhered to so far. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. One of the things I dig into in the book is why are some bans adhered to and others are not? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with actually whether there is a treaty. Treaties are violated all the time. It has to do with things like reciprocity. If I violate this ban, what's going to happen? If the other side has the weapon and they're going to use it against you, that's a compelling reason not to use it, and probably a major factor in not using poison gas in World War II. Another factor is the expected value of the weapon. In World War I, when Germany first used poison gas, the expectation was that it would be a game changer. It would break the front. Not actually true, just made the fighting more horrible for everyone. But what is the value of this weapon? Another one is, can you verify whether someone is not doing it? That's a major factor in restraint. So one of the things I go through in the book is kind of all of these, and I talk through at the end different factors affecting autonomous weapons. I think it's likely that a ban on autonomous weapons that would be sort of comprehensive is probably not going to happen politically. Certainly the US is not there. Russia and other great powers aren't there either. It's also reasonable to think that it wouldn't actually hold up in wartime. But there might be more narrow regulations on things like, for example, autonomous weapons that would target people that might, where some of those factors that I mentioned might change, and you could, I think reasonably imagine that might be successful.
The Center for New American Security website does not list Africa as one of the several search areas for national security and defense policies. Is there any movement to address Africa?
We're a pretty small organization. We've got about 40 full-time staff. We're focused entirely on national security issues, so we don't do domestic policy or healthcare or other things like some DC think tanks. There's certainly a lot of national security concerns in Africa, but given our size of our research staff, we have to be pretty choosy where we focus on. We have about 7 research programs. I run our technology program. We have a defense program. We have one on Europe, one on the Middle East, one on Asia, one on veterans issues, and one on energy and economic issues, looking at things like financial sanctions. We don't have an Africa program. I don't think it's in the works. Maybe that would change, but I think it's unlikely in the near term.
How do you feel the calculus of fear changes for both the military and civilian with the use of autonomous weapons?
There have been a lot of interesting concerns that people have raised about how this might change warfare. One of them are concerns about fairness. This idea that, well, if you send the robot to do your fighting, then that changes the dynamic because there's no one to fight against. My observation is that war's not fair. It's not supposed to be fair. Most every military technology since the invention of a slingshot was intended to get greater standoff from the adversary and hurt them without putting yourself at risk. I'm not sure that's a major factor in practice. There are concerns about chivalry that often come up in this context. I often hear this from warfighters, where the biggest objection to robotic vehicles, I'll hear from fighter pilots, for example, who'll say, well, it's not, they won't use it from chivalrous, but basically say it's not honorable, right, to not be out there. You've got to be out there. Again, I'll point out, look, if you were, say, flying a fighter jet over Afghanistan and dropping bombs on the Taliban, you're not really at risk, right? Like, the point of warfare is to not put yourself at risk. So we'll see. I think a more profound challenge with this technology is decreasing human control over what happens in warfare and moving to a domain where there's action happening on the battlefield at a pace that's too quick for humans to respond. Some Chinese scholars have envisioned what they call a battlefield singularity in the future. A point in time where what's happening on the battlefield is so fast, humans cannot possibly keep up. And it's entirely automated. So similar to what I talked earlier about these automated defensive systems that protect ships, but at the operational level across the entire battlefront. But it's possible to envision that in the future, and I think that would change how we think about war in very profound ways.
Paul, we have 2 questions left. This is another interesting one. Not taking ethics into account. Are fully autonomous weapons a necessity after the first country, friend or foe, implements them? And The example is, will countries, groups that do not have them be at a disadvantage without them?
So one of the things that's a great question. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was sort of this case of poison gas. So in World War I, you have poison gas use, not in World War II. One big factor being in World War I, people think it's going to be valuable. In World War II, people realize it's not going to do anything other than just make it all more miserable for everybody involved. It's not going to break the front or dramatically change things. A big unknown in this space is how valuable are these weapons? You'll have many people talk about these as though they are total game changers, right? If you have autonomous weapons, someone else does it, you have to respond. That's not the case for everything, for all technologies. If Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons, that would not have changed the outcome of the war, ultimately. Might have slowed the US down a little bit, but it wouldn't have changed either the Gulf War or the 2003 Iraq invasion. In this case, it's just not clear. I think it's really honestly not clear with autonomous weapons how valuable they are. If you think about robotics and autonomy as a whole, extremely valuable. If you think about this narrow instance of taking humans entirely out of the equation, humans add a lot of value. This is still the most advanced cognitive processing system on the planet, the human brain. The two instances where you'd want to take humans out might be speed, as I mentioned earlier, or if you have this robotic vehicle that's on its own. And you can see instances where that might be necessary and valuable. It's not clear, though, if you said, well, I'm going to require humans to make these final decisions. So I'm going to have that robotic vehicle out there, and it finds the North Korean mobile missile launchers. But I want humans to make those decisions, so I'm going to build a communications bridge back. I'm going to have a bridge of robotic vehicles and aircraft that are acting as communications relays. And just a little bit further back, there's a human who's just, yep, that's OK, I authorize that target. They press a button. How much does that take away from a military advantage? I think we don't know, actually. I think it depends a lot, actually, on how militaries might use the technology. If we envision, as the DoD talks about today, a model of human-machine teaming, of, for example, destroyers and F-35s and tanks and other vehicles that have people in them operating alongside robotic vehicles, we may lose very little, in fact, if you can have robust and reliable short-range communications. We'll see.
This goes back to the Terminator. Oh. Do you think there's a kill switch that humans could create if we built Skynet for war and artificial intelligence is smarter than humans? And then parenthetically, as it may be in the future, and then the Go example that you raise in the book wins.
Oh, good. Someone who checked out the book. So, yeah, so I talk in the book about, we've seen this in a number of different domains of games, where people have been able to train machines to play at superhuman levels. Chess fell to computers 20 years ago now. More recently, the AI research company DeepMind trained a computer to play the Chinese strategy game Go at superhuman levels. And they actually were able to have this play Go without any human training data. They gave it the rules of the game, and it taught itself how to play, and could reach superhuman levels of play. Actually plays differently than humans, which is really quite interesting. They created a similar version to play chess, and it learned to play, again, with no training data, superhuman levels of performance at chess in 4 hours. 4 hours. It eclipsed all of human knowledge in chess. Now, the real world's a lot more complex than chess, but you can see this is very powerful technology that people are building. What was the question? I lost track because I think it's such an interesting example. Terminator, should we build a kill switch? Sure. If we build these things, yes. I mean, we should be building ways to take control of these. One of the things that happens, and you see the examples of the systems I gave today where we have physical access. There's a key. In the book, I went down to the Aegis Training Center in Dahlgren, Virginia, and they showed me sort of a mock-up of their demo. And they have this physical key they can pull out that can kill, if you will, an Aegis combat system if it begins to malfunction. One of the things we've seen in machine learning is these systems are very powerful. They learn weird things. One of my favorite examples of this is a program that someone trained to learn to play old Nintendo games from the 80s. And it was learning to play Tetris. Turned out to be not very good at Tetris for a variety of reasons. But one of the things it did was very clever was right before the last brick fell, It paused the game so that it could never lose. It's awesome. It's like the kind of thing my 5-year-old would do. And that's technically allowed in the rules that it was given. It was given access to the controller, and it could push all the buttons, and it was told, like, win, or at least don't lose. So here's an example of, at a technical level, the failure mode is called reward hacking, where it does something that is allowed, but not really what you meant. It comes up all the time in machine learning systems. So we want to protect against those kinds of failures, and one of those is keeping humans in the loop or keeping the ability to humans to intervene and turn a system off if necessary. It just gets harder if you have, say, a cyber system like Stuxnet that's on its own, or a robotic vehicle that's operating independently.
Here it is. A professor from Stanford recently released a hypothetical video showing small autonomous drone swarms with explosives raiding universities and other facilities, targeting and killing individuals who had posted certain political views online. What are your thoughts regarding non-state actors or other groups, i.e. repressive regimes, that may use these technologies for non-war purposes?
Okay, so people are not familiar, I'm very familiar with this video. People are not familiar with it. It's a video that a professor made. Sort of a fictional story about how in the future, basically militaries would build weapons like this, small little micro drones about this big, that were designed to go and kill people. And they had facial recognition on them. You could program in your enemies, and they'd fly into a city, and then come up to you and like blow up your head. And in this video, this fictional story, militaries build billions of these as weapons of mass destruction, and then they get loose into the wrong hands, and then they're used in these attacks, and they kill thousands of innocent people. I will say in full transparency, I hate the video. I think it does something that is dangerous with fictionalized stories and takes something that is technologically doable today. It is definitely doable to build something like this today. But then crafts this fictionalized scenario that creates a lot of hype. And I don't think it's very realistic. And the authors and I actually had a series of exchanges in IEEE Spectrum, go back and forth about the video. I do think the broader question about terrorist attacks is valid. We have the video side, and we have seen attacks by the Islamic State using crude homemade armed drones. One of the things that I do in the book is I try to understand how hard would it be to build one of these things in your garage? Like, what does it really take to do that? So I'll give you the spoiler. It's terrifyingly possible, actually. The things you would need to do this would be, you need the platform, you need the robotic vehicle, you need a weapon on it, and you need the smarts for it to make these decisions on its own. So you can buy an autonomous quadcopter online for a couple $100. And they're pretty advanced. They can take off and land on their own. They can fly GPS points on their own. They can track and follow moving objects all by themselves. And they can avoid obstacles like trees on their own. So that's doable. People have put guns on them. It seems like one of the two things that people do when they get a hold of drones, really, whether it's a country or an individual, the first thing they do is they fly it someplace that doesn't belong, and the second thing they do is they put a gun on it. And in the US, we've had people do this. There was a teenager in Connecticut who actually put a flamethrower on a drone and took it out in the forest and basted a turkey for Thanksgiving with it, posted the video on YouTube, and there was an investigation by the FBI and FAA. Fascinatingly, in America, not illegal to do that, provided that it's below a certain altitude for airspace reasons and it's on your own property, totally okay. So how hard is it to put the brains on this thing that would do the autonomous targeting? You can download for free online trained neural networks that have humans as objects. Took me about 3 minutes online to find one that you could download for free that could do this. And to really understand, like, what would it take human capital-wise to have that know how to do this? I went to a local high school in Northern Virginia. It's a math and science magnet academy, but these were high school students. And I talked to the professors there. I was like, what are your kids doing in robotics and neural networks, and what's their programming abilities? And they were like, oh yeah, our kids do that. I mean, they can program in Python. We have a class next year on neural networks for object identification. That's all very doable. So a reasonably competent, like, computer science undergrad could build something like this in their garage. Are they going to build billions of them? Probably not. But it is a legitimate concern that we might face these kinds of weapons in the hands of terrorists. I think more fundamentally, it's a challenge going forward with this technology overall, which is to say that, you know, there's what the US might do, there's American values, but then there's what are others going to do, nation states and terrorists. Even if you had a treaty that banned these weapons, look, not everyone cares. Bashar al-Assad is using chemical weapons in Syria today. Chemical weapons are illegal. Doesn't stop him. So that's a reality that we're going to have to contend with, is what others might do, and we're going to have to be prepared for that. That's a horribly dark note to end things on. I feel like there's something more positive to say. But I don't know, that was the last question.
Paul, we want to thank you for not only your efforts in writing the book, because clearly you have, as the last question has indicated, it's a provocative topic. It's probably going to have the lawyers and the ethicists flailing about making money for years and years and years as they try to work through the solution. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause for Paul, and then we'll move over.